The central bank has kept the benchmark interest rate steady at 3.5% for the 13th straight session, citing household debt risks. As the nation is going through the annual Ulji exercises, a civil air raid drill took place across the country this afternoon, while down in Busan, a counter-terrorism drill took place encompassing civil, government, military, and police. COVID-19 infections show signs of slowing amid the summer resurgence. The health authorities are tightening their response systems for the upcoming Chuseok holiday. It's August 22nd, 6 p.m. in Seoul. This is Newscenter. Thank you for joining us. I'm Yoon Jung-min. We start with the central bank's latest decision regarding its base rate, which remains unchanged at 3.5%, marking the longest rate freeze streak. In the meantime, South Korea's growth outlook for this year has been slightly cut to 2.4%. Our correspondent Lee Soo-jin has the numbers.
The Bank of Korea has held its benchmark interest rate steady at 3.5% in a decision that was announced on Thursday following the second Monetary Policy Committee meeting of the second half of the year.
We have unanimously decided that it would be appropriate to maintain our current monetary tightening stance while inflation is slowing, because we need to monitor the impact that real estate policies and global risk aversion will have on financial stability.
This is the 13th time in a row that the BOK has decided not to change the rate, its longest rate freeze streak. The base rate was last raised in January 2023 to the current 3.5% and has been left steady since then. The rate freeze decision this month comes despite inflation remaining in the 2% range for 4 straight months. Recent data shows that the country's consumer price index, a key gauge of inflation, rose 2.6% in July compared to the same month last year. This is higher than it was in June, though, when consumer prices rose by 2.4%. There are also ongoing concerns about growing household debt and housing prices. Data released by the Bank of Korea on Tuesday showed that the country's balance of household credit, an indicator of household debt, reached the highest level on record on a quarterly basis, mostly due to mortgages. This comes as home prices in Seoul went up by 0.76% compared to the previous month, the largest rise seen since December 2019, according to the Korea Real Estate Board. The BOK's decision was also influenced by the U.S. Central Bank, which in its most recent meeting decided to keep interest rates unchanged. The Fed, however, is widely expected to cut interest rates from as early as September.
Recent revisions have shown that while the U.S. labor market is not bad, it's not as strong as the preliminary figures made it out to be. The BOK will follow in the meeting on October to lower Korea's interest rates by the same 25 basis points.
Also on Thursday, the BOK lowered its economic growth outlook for this year to 2.4% from 2.5%. The BOK said that it did so because the previous forecast was based on large growth in the first quarter, which is mostly due to temporary factors. And this year's inflation forecast was also lowered to 2.5%. Moving forward, the Bank of Korea says it will remain vigilant in keeping inflation under control and will decide on the timing of rate cuts while monitoring economic growth. Lee Soo-jin, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, speculation is mounting about a rate cut in September by the U.S. Federal Reserve following the release of July's meeting minutes. Lee Seung-jae has the details.
From March 2022 to July 2023, the U.S. Federal Reserve raised its key interest rate a total of 11 times. Since then, the benchmark lending rate has remained in the 5.25 to 5.5% range. However, that could change next month with the Federal Open Market Committee set to make its next rate decision. According to minutes of the FOMC from July 30th to 31st, released on Wednesday, the vast majority of members believe it would be appropriate to lower the benchmark interest rate in September if economic indicators proceed as expected. Watchers are anticipating a 50 basis point cut, in line with the Chicago Mercantile Exchange Group Fed Watch, which indicated a 39% chance that the U.S. Central Bank would lower the benchmark interest rate by 50 basis points next month. Recent employment figures released by Washington further fuel the prospect of a rate cut next month. According to the U.S. Department of Labor's Bureau of Labor Statistics on Wednesday, the U.S. job market is not as hot as initially thought. Data showed that there were 818,000 fewer jobs in March of this year than initially reported. This means that the U.S. job growth from April 2023 to March 2024 was about 30% lower than previously reported, marking the biggest downward revision since 2009. Traditionally, the U.S. Fed cuts rates on poor employment data, with the latest figures putting pressure on policymakers to cut rates. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
The nationwide air raid drill that's carried out every year to better prepare the country in case of an attack from North Korea was held this afternoon. People were instructed to seek shelter and traffic was blocked in certain areas. Bae Yoon-ji has this report.
Air raid sirens blared across the country at 2 p.m. on Thursday as South Korea held its annual air raid drill. During the 20-minute drill that was carried out to raise public awareness of emergency response measures, pedestrians on the street were required to move to designated shelters or nearby underground spaces. Traffic was blocked in some areas, including downtown Seoul, as drivers were instructed to pull to the side of the road while traffic lights remained on red for 5 minutes to allow passengers and vehicles to safely evacuate. There are about 17,000 shelters across the country, installed in places such as apartment basements and subway stations. Thursday's drill was carried out on the last day of the 4-day Ulji civil defense exercises, held alongside the ongoing Ulji Freedom Shield drills, which South Korean and U.S. troops began on Monday to boost joint readiness against threats from North Korea. During this week's civil defense drills, the Defense Ministry said it held a meeting to discuss the nation's response measures in case of a nuclear attack from North Korea. In the meeting that involved the military and 11 different government agencies, they reviewed the country's defense posture against a possible nuclear attack and discussed detailed plans to support chemical, biological, radiological, and medical units. Meanwhile, military officials from Seoul and Washington have been watching closely for a potential provocation from North Korea, as Pyongyang has been strongly criticizing the Ulji Freedom Shield combined exercises, calling them a rehearsal for an invasion. Bae Yoon-ji, Arirang News.
Staying with the Ulji exercise, it has brought civil, government, military, and police together for an integrated defense drill at the port city of Busan to counter terrorism for maritime facilities. Our defense correspondent Choi Min-jung brings the highlights.
Around 10 enemy drones approach the Busan port. South Korea's military immediately fires Vulcan cannons and Shingung surface-to-air missiles to target them. The terrorists then try to escape overseas using a passenger ship. But the Navy, Coast Guard, and military police swiftly surround and infiltrate the ship, preventing the terrorists from fleeing. And on land, military armored vehicles block their escape route. Then, special forces from the military and police hijack a bus to shoot down the terrorists. The training, which took place on Wednesday, was conducted as part of the Ulji Freedom Shield exercise. It reflected North Korea's increasingly diverse provocations, including terrorism against multi-use and maritime facilities, as well as drone attacks. The drill involved around 300 people from nearly 40 civilian, government, military, and police agencies.
We will continue to conduct drills reflecting the complex and diverse situations to establish a perfect counterterrorism posture.
Relevant agencies vowed to continue working to further strengthen their joint defense posture in the future. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
In other news, the number of coronavirus infections began showing a downward trend this week, while medical systems are being tightened amid the summer resurgence. Choi Soo-young has the details.
The increasing trend of COVID-19 in patients in South Korea during this summer has declined this week compared to last week. The quarantine authorities said the number of patients from 220 hospitals nationwide increased by about 55% in the second week of August from 880 to 1,366, while it rose by 5.7% in the third week, reaching 1,444. The authorities predicted that this trend will peak later this month before decreasing, stating that the current management system is sufficient to handle the situation. In case of a potential uptick in cases, the government said on Thursday it will strengthen medical systems, especially in preparation for the Chuseok holiday, which is about a month away.
Government will operate a thorough medical system checkup during the Chuseok holiday to ensure there are no gaps in services. If the COVID-19 outbreak continues and more emergency patients arise, the government will ensure that more hospitals and clinics are on duty compared to previous years.
It has announced that treatment medicines for about 180,000 people will be distributed starting next week, planning to cover high-risk groups until October. These supplies, including test kits, will be provided more steadily through the general healthcare system after October. The Health Ministry recently said that effective vaccines against the current variants will be supplied starting in October, urging people to follow personal hygiene measures. Cho Hyung, Arirang News.
On the cultural front, Korean films have been performing well in theaters with mid-budget movies such as Escape starring Lee Jae-hoon and Koo Kyo-hwan being big hits during the peak summer season in July. According to the Korean Film Council's industry report released on Thursday, the number of Korean film admissions in July reached 5.6 million, a 69% increase from the same month last year. This figure also surpassed the pre-pandemic July average by around 8% from 2017 to 19. The council analyzed that the existing box office formula of major motion pictures, the so-called tentpole movies, are fading away. Mid-budget movies can break even with around 2 million tickets sold. In the U.S., Minnesota Governor Tim Walz was officially named the Democratic vice presidential candidate at the DNC for the November election. Key figures took the stage at the convention to support for Kamala Harris as the next president. Lee Eun-hee tells us more.
The Democratic Party officially named Minnesota Governor Tim Walz as their vice presidential candidate on Wednesday for the November 2024 election. During the third night of the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, the 60-year-old Minnesota governor took the stage to deliver his keynote speech and accept the nomination.
It's the honor of my life to accept your nomination for Vice President of the United States.
Now the race is set for a matchup between Walz and his Republican opponent, Senator J.D. Vance, who has built a reputation as a strong conservative voice and former venture capitalist. Walz has a military background with the U.S. Army National Guard and experience as a high school teacher and football coach. A poll released Wednesday by AP found that 36% of Americans view Walz favorably, compared to 27% for Vance. However, the poll also found that many Americans are still unfamiliar with both candidates. The night showcased speeches in support of Vice President Kamala Harris as the next president, featuring figures like former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and former President Bill Clinton. Clinton thanked President Joe Biden for his courage and sacrifice, highlighting how Biden's decision to step down will enhance his legacy. Media personality Oprah Winfrey surprised the crowd with a powerful speech centered on freedom.
But more than anything else, let us choose freedom. Why? Because that's the best of America.
Harris will formally accept the Democratic Party's nomination and deliver the keynote speech on Thursday, the last night of the convention. The first TV debate between the two vice presidential candidates is set for October 1st. Lee Eun-hee, Arirang News.
Elsewhere, Russia's defense ministry claims its air forces shot down about a dozen Ukrainian drones over Moscow in the largest air raid against its capital area since the start of its war in 2022. Lee Eun-jin has more.
Russia's defense ministry said its air defenses repelled a total of 45 drones in Russian territory on Wednesday, including 11 over the Moscow region, 23 over the border region of Bryansk, and 6 over the Belgorod region. Russian authorities, as well as the mayor of Moscow, called it among the most significant attacks on Moscow by Ukrainian drones since the start of the war in February 2022. According to the acting governor of the Bryansk region, no injuries or major damage was reported in the Moscow or Bryansk regions, but in the Kursk region, 1 woman was killed and 2 other people hospitalized. Ukraine previously targeted Russia's capital in July 2023 when drones struck 2 non-residential buildings, and a second time in November 2023 when Moscow was reported to have stopped more than 20 drones. The overnight drone attacks came as Ukrainian forces continued to push into Russia's western Kursk region. Ukraine's strike on 3 key bridges in the last week has trapped Russian forces, as well as crippling their logistical capabilities. Russia subsequently built at least 3 pontoon bridges across the Sime River, but at least one of those is confirmed to have been destroyed by a Ukrainian drone on Wednesday. While stretched thin, Ukrainian forces are moving towards the goal of its land incursion into the Kursk region, which Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said is to create a buffer zone as well as weaken the Russian military. Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin continues to claim that the Ukrainian attacks are acts of terrorism.
The same way we fought with terrorists previously, now we fight with those who commit crimes in the Kursk region, Donbass and Novorossiya. But the same way we achieved our goals in the fight against terrorism, we will achieve our goals in the fight against neo-Nazism. And we will certainly punish the criminals. There can be no doubt about that.
And going on with business as usual, Putin welcomed Chinese Premier Li Qiang to Moscow on Wednesday, praising the close economic and trade relations between the 2 countries, while there was no indication of whether the ongoing war with Ukraine was discussed. Lee Eun-jin, Arirang News.
With electric vehicles become used more, concerns are also rising over their safety with recent incidents of EV fires. It's the topic of our business segment today. Our economics correspondent Moon Hae-ryun joins me in the studio. Hae-ryun, tell us why safety regarding EV batteries has recently become such an issue here in Korea.
So it all began on August 1st when a fire broke out in the underground parking lot of an apartment complex in Incheon. A Mercedes-Benz EQE electric car using Foras's energy batteries appeared to spontaneously catch on fire, consequently destroying 87 other vehicles and damaging 783 more. The fire took more than 8 hours to put out, and the apartment's residents were taken to hospital and moved to temporary shelters after being unable to return home. The police are still investigating, and forensics are being reviewed to find out exactly which aspect of its battery caused the fire. It's expected to take around a month until the results are out, but in the meantime, the incident sparked fears over the safety of electric vehicles. According to data from K-Car, a South Korean auto trading platform, the number of EVs put up for sale nearly doubled the week following the fire compared to the week before. A different used car platform, N-Car, showed that prices this month of some popular EVs, such as Hyundai Motors' Ioniq 5 and Kia's EV6, fell in contrast to last month, as did Tesla's Model 3 and Model Y.
Hae-ryun, is this happening only in South Korea?
Not at all, Changmin. Actually, to help consumers, EV battery regulations are being put into place in countries all around the world. In the United States, the state of California will be implementing a battery labeling system starting in 2026 to provide consumers with information such as manufacturer, voltage, and unit capacity. The European Union will also introduce a similar digital battery passport system in 2027. Following the fire in Incheon, related government ministries in South Korea came together to discuss measures to prevent recurrences of such events. On top of inspecting firefighting facilities and underground parking spaces, the government has advised EV firms to release information on battery manufacturers used in their vehicles to ease car buyers' concerns. Next month, the government plans to release a more comprehensive solution.
The question of whether or not to make labeling the manufacturer of EV batteries mandatory will be included in the comprehensive measures to be announced in early September, along with other content.
Despite the fact that it has not been made mandatory as of yet, most EV firms selling in South Korea stepped up to release information about the manufacturers of batteries used in their vehicles, starting with Hyundai Motor. But it wasn't just domestic firms that published their battery information. Tesla too has disclosed the battery makers in their EV models through the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure and Transport, after being met with backlash from local buyers. The majority of EVs listed use South Korean batteries, while around a quarter used Chinese batteries.
Will releasing information about battery manufacturers actually help consumers, and how would that affect the EV battery market for domestic firms?
Well, Tungmin, that's actually a very difficult question to answer, because in order to answer that question, we need to know whether the problem lies behind electric vehicle batteries as a whole, how people use them, or whether it's something to do with the manufacturing process. And here's what an expert said.
I think the effect of mistakes made during manufacturing is actually greater than the effect of surrounding temperature or overcharging. Personally, I think revealing manufacturer information would be effective, so manufacturers will be more responsible when making their products.
Professor Nam went on to explain that manufacturers will put a charging limit on batteries so overcharging or temperature risks are less likely to occur than, say, an issue with overpackaging the battery that could make it more prone to fires. With so much focus on EV battery manufacturers, experts say that domestic firms could benefit in the short term after it began to lose ground with China's cheaper batteries in recent years.
All right, thanks for the report today, Heatwave.
Thank you for having me, Tungmin.
Last night, Seoul broke another record for the longest run of tropical nights with 32 consecutive days. Today's Choseol, which means end of heat, but the hot weather continued despite the rain. Temperatures will rise again as warm westerly winds flow into Korea. From tomorrow, scorching heat of around 33 degrees Celsius will continue with frequent showers. There will be showers in western regions until tomorrow evening. The amount of rainfall will be as low as 5 to 20 millimeters, but you should take an umbrella that is easy to carry in case it suddenly starts to rain. Tomorrow's Seoul and Daegu will start off at 26 degrees. Highs will move up to 32 in Seoul, Chuncheon, Daejeon, Gwangju and Jeju, Gyeongju 36 degrees. On Saturday, showers will pass over Gangwon-do province. Tropical nights and heat waves are expected to continue until the end of this month. That's all for Korea. Here are the weather conditions around the world. And that is Newscenter for tonight. Thank you for watching. A panel session up next.
children's laughter, hope, dream. K-animation belongs in them. Interesting and valuable story that transcends between everyday life and dream. Surprising spectacle where imagination becomes real. an array of subjects catering from infants to adolescents. For our story to reach all corners of the world. K-animation makes healthy laughter for children.
Hello and welcome to Within the Frame. I'm Handan in Heatwave. The Bank of Korea kept the base rate steady at 3.5%, extending its rate freeze for the 13th straight time. All members of the Monetary Policy Board agreed on the rate freeze, with some leaving room for a rate cut within the next 3 months. It also revised down Korea's growth forecast this year from 2.5% to 2.4%. This as Korea and the world await more clues from U.S. Fed Chair Jerome Powell, who's expected to address global central bankers at the upcoming Jackson Hole Symposium. For deeper economic insights into these developments and what to expect going forward, Kim Se-wan, professor of economics at Ewha Women's University, joins us via Skype. It's always a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me today.
And joining us from Hong Kong is Trinh Nguyen, senior economist at Natixis. Thank you, as always, for being with us.
Thank you very much.
All right.
It's a pleasure.
Professor Kim, let's start off with you. So the Bank of Korea kept its benchmark interest rate steady. What are the key factors behind the decision that we should know about?
As you said, Bank of Korea has decided to leave its key interest rate at current level of 3.5% today. But actually, there were rising market expectations on Bank of Korea's interest rate cut today by 0.25%. For example, KDI, government's think tank, suggested before a preemptive interest rate cut in August. They argued that domestic consumption and investments are weakening due to higher interest rate. So I'm pretty much sure that Bank of Korea will cut its base interest rate by 0.25% in October after seeing U.S. Fed's interest rate cut in September. Related to interest rate cut, Bank of Korea believes that lower interest rate in Korea could trigger an unstable financial market by raising mortgage loan. Also, lower interest rate destabilized foreign exchange market by raising $1 exchange rate. The higher $1 exchange rate can be another pressure to raise domestic price level by increasing importing prices.
So you expect the Bank of Korea to start cutting rates sometime in October following the U.S. Fed's rate decision. But the Bank of Korea is deeply concerned about the risks stemming from rising housing prices and household debt. So it looks like we won't be able to see a rate cut until the BOK has conviction about those risks, which leads us to our next question, Professor Kim. BOK Governor Lee Chang-yong held a Q&A session with the press, touching upon various subjects from the government's real estate policy to domestic spending. What are some key points that caught your attention?
Well, Bank of Korea is under difficult situation between curbing household loan and recovering economy. Governor Lee talked much about this difficult position of Bank of Korea at the Q&A session after deciding the interest rate leave as it is. From the first quarter of this year, household loan is increasing quickly due to rising housing prices. In July, household loan increased by 5.5 trillion won. The balance of household loans at the 5 major commercial banks stood at about 720 trillion won as of this month. For restricting household loan, all major banks are raising mortgage rates. For example, Shinhan Bank, one of the largest banks in South Korea, raises mortgage rates by up to 0.5% last week, which was 5th increase in a month. And all other commercial banks are following this raising in, mortgage interest rate. But at the same time, the biggest factor hindering economic recovery in Korea is the weak domestic demand due to higher interest rate. Both of households' consumption and corporations' investments are declining compared to last year as higher interest rate continues. But as we have seen from previous report, as the policy focus shifts toward economic recovery this month and next month, Bank of Korea will cut its rate in the next meeting in October to stimulate domestic spending and recovering economy.
The Bank of Korea basically reined in the housing market, saying it's trying hard to stop the rise and avoid exacerbating the drag that household debt puts on long-term economic growth. And as you pointed out, sluggish domestic demand is another big factor that's dragging down Korea's overall economy. Now, Trin, the Jackson Hole Symposium, a gathering of central bankers worldwide, will kick off tomorrow. And much attention, obviously, is drawn to U.S. Federal Reserve Jerome Powell's speech. What clues would he provide about U.S. rate cuts?
Well, I think for many people, the weakness of the labor market, and particularly after the BLS downward revision by roughly almost 1 million jobs, point to the fact that the U.S. economy is softening. But the question is, how worried should he be about this? And I think, there's a 100 basis point price hit, which means that we're going to need one jumbo hike of 50 basis points, or the rates market would have to reprice its exuberant expectations of the U.S. economy. So it's going to be very important, the tone that he sets, how dovish he is. So far, markets have read much of everything that's happened in the past week as relatively dovish, from the minutes to the Fed speakers to the data. So if he wants to push back rate cut expectations, he will need to adopt a much more cautious tone, I would imagine. I do think that the Fed is going to follow very similar to what the RBNZ already did, which is to start with 25 basis point hike and wait for data dependency. We have softening of gains of the U.S. jobs. We are not yet seeing layoffs and contractions and signs of recessions. What's very clear is that real interest rate is high, so some softening is expected. It's a question of whether or not we're going to get the Goldilocks scenario, which is the economy slowing, but at a very decent level, and enough for the Fed to cut rates substantially. And I think something has got to give, and I think very likely what's going to give is really Jerome Powell trying to push back some of this short-term rate cut expectations.
So inflation and job market data, as you pointed out, will be the key in deciding the timing of the U.S. rate cut. But what about external factors? What outside variables may impact the U.S. Fed's monetary policy?
Obviously, commodity market, supply chains, disruptions, geopolitical risk, financial conditions. For example, we have a railway strike right now in Canada. But generally speaking, if you look at most of the inflation in the U.S., it started with goods inflation driven by supply chain disruption, and then translating to services, right? So many of those factors were quite external. So that's going to be quite important. But most of the issues in the U.S. are generally quite domestic driven. And the second factor, of course, is that for us to really get these aggressive rate cut price in for 2024, you will need severe contraction of the economy, or you can say that financial instability, and that could be driven not necessarily by the U.S. As you can see what happened with the BOJ and how that unwinding of the yen carry trade can really destabilize. That obviously got quickly pushed away as people realize that there's no recession in the U.S., but financial instability is another factor to look out for. But all in all, we don't think these things are going to be, in the short term, be quite significant. I think U.S. data itself is going to be quite important. Commodity prices have come down. U.S. data in terms of U.S. inflation, U.S. The data in terms of underlying growth numbers will be very key for Jerome Powell. And I think what I think is going to really happen is that he's going to wait for significant deterioration of data, right? you can always start with a jumbo cut later. You can start very gradually, right, with 25 basis points. If need be, it could be 50, aggressively to 75. If he makes a policy mistake of cutting when inflation could potentially spike for a number of reasons, for the reasons I mentioned, geopolitics is one, geopolitical disruption, climate change. You can have just a bad yield on agriculture harvest, right? That can be hugely impactful. Droughts can impact the Suez Canal and so on and so forth, right? So I do think that he's going to strike a very cautious tone and use words such as data dependency and mostly U.S. data at the moment.
Professor Kim, amid increasing global oil price volatilities, the Korean government has extended fuel tax cuts for another 2 months. Consumers will get a 20% deduction on gasoline and 30% on diesel and LPG until October 31st. Would this help in stabilizing prices?
I believe so. Even though inflation pressure is pretty much weakened at 2.6% on year in July, Korean government will maintain the reduction in fuel taxes to strengthen price stability. The Ministry of Economy and Finance announced that considering the uncertainty in domestic and international oil prices due to tensions in Middle East and domestic inflation trends, it plans to extend the reduction of fuel tax flexible rate until October 31st. Actually, Korean government expanded the fuel tax reduction for gas and diesel to 37% in July 2022 to stabilize prices. But in 2022, we need to remember that inflation level almost exceeded 6% on year. However, starting this year and last year, the reduction for gas was scaled back to 25%, and the sunset deadline for this measure has been extended since then. But I believe that this fuel tax reduction will be discontinued sometime early next year, 2025, to save Korean government's tax revenues.
What's your inflation outlook for this year?
Well, inflation will be pretty much stabilized for this year. As we talked about, the most recently updated inflation rate is about 2.6%, and 2% annual inflation rate is under the government's inflation and Bank of Korea's inflation target. But as Korean economy is weakening this year, we can expect that the inflation rate will be decreased down to 2.5% in 2024.
The BOK also seems quite confident about cooling inflation. It projects inflation to continue to slow down the road this year, staying in the 2.5% range. Now, Trin, gold prices have hit a fresh high with a standard gold bar now worth more than $1 million. What's driving gold prices to new heights?
Demand, more buying from central banks, more buying from individuals. In terms of actually physical gold, I think the fact that there are two reasons for it. You can think of it as geopolitical risk. Risk can spike to impact financial markets, but geopolitical risks are simmering in the background. You have Ukraine, Russia. You have the Middle East, and also within Asia, it's also simmering, right? So as a result, the people are not very confident about the current global order can be sustained, and there's a lot of uncertainty. Gold can be seen as a way to hedge some of that. Gold obviously provides no yield, and it actually physical gold has a storage cost, but it doesn't have counterparty risk, such as, for example, digital currency that people have invested in some of the brokerages have gone under the latest. And the second thing is, of course, the fact that yields for the US dollar have come down. fact that gold has no yield, it's being helped, right? So overall, much of it is due to demand, demand to hedge, and demand for physical assets, particularly gold, which actually is much smaller than buying, for example, a physical asset such as a house, and due to the fact that we have a lot of geopolitical uncertainty, and so as a result, gold prices have surged quite substantially. Now, I think part of it is also driven by the buying in China. Traditionally, it's driven by fundamental demand for cultural reasons, such as India. But in China, the fact that the stock market continues to be quite weak, the bond market, after rallying, is being suppressed by the government. And of course, the real estate market is recovering, is very sluggish. So as a result, you have a lot of physical demand for gold, right? And I think with geopolitical tensions and uncertainty about the future, demand will remain quite robust, especially as yields on the dollar decline.
So global banks, as well as individual investors, more of them place their bets on gold amid various factors, including rising geopolitical tensions. And Trin, how long would the dollar slump continue, and how would it impact global currencies, including the Korean won?
Well, there's a lot of pricing right now for rate cuts, right? One of the reasons, and this is something that I repeatedly say, that a lot of the rallying of the Asian currencies, including the Korean won, but most importantly, the ASEAN currencies like IDR, Malaysian ringgit, the Thai baht, and so on and so forth, is driven by the dollar, right? The BOK didn't cut. It's really the massive pricing and the repricing in of cuts for 2024 and 2025, right? So the question is, can we have further rallies? Yes, if we have significant weakness of U.S. data, right? So, for example, if somehow, as I mentioned, it's all very much about data dependency. If you have significant weakness of the U.S. data, you can have markets pricing in much more rate cuts. Is that very likely? Probably not. But that can happen. So the dollar, in my opinion, in the short term seems quite strong, quite too weak in the moment. Meaning, I do think that unless the data comes out surprisingly very weak in the short term, the next several months, you can see the dollar strengthening a bit. So, for example, today, after the dollar weakening significantly, today the dollar rallied a bit, just because people are quite cautious on what kind of tone the U.S. will strike, the U.S. Central Bank will strike. But beyond the tone, I do think the data itself will be quite important. So for now, the dollar, in terms of a longer-term trend, has peaked because we're starting our descent of U.S. dollar rates. The big uncertainty, I do think, is where both the short end and the longer end, and I do think that there's a bit too much exuberance in terms of rate cuts expectation in 2024. 2025 seems a bit about right, but beyond that, even 2026, right? So there's a lot of repricing that can happen, so a lot of volatility that could happen in the short term, but the dollar does look a bit oversold in the next several months.
Professor Kim, the Bank of Korea lowered this year's growth outlook for Korea from 2.5% to 2.4%. What insights can we draw from this?
Basically, the updated lower economic growth forecast confirms Bank of Korea's interest rate cut in the next meeting in October. Considering the unusually high growth rate of 1.3% in the first quarter, Bank of Korea's annual forecast was significantly revised upward from 2.1% to 2.5% in May. However, just 3 months later, expectations for Korean economy has been slightly lowered. So it needs to be noted that Bank of Korea's expectation on Korean economy early this year was too much positive compared to the reality of today. Bank of Korea says in their report released today that the volatility in financial markets has increased and geopolitical risks have been escalated. The Bank of Korea's latest projection of 2.4% economic growth is lower than not only the government's and the OECD's forecast of 2.6%, but also the projections of 2.5% from KDI, government think tanks, and International Monetary Fund, or IMF.
And the BOK unveiled its quarterly projections for the first time, which is expected to act as the dot plot of the U.S. Federal Reserve. Could you elaborate on what role the BOK's new quarterly projections will play?
This revised economic outlook marks the first time the Bank of Korea has released quarterly economic forecast figures. Previously, they only disclosed semi-annual over 6 month and annual forecast, while the quarterly figures were used internally. So the quarterly forecast was something like a secret of the Bank of Korea so far. This is the first time Bank of Korea making its internal data available to the public. The market has positively, of course, estimated the Bank of Korea's release of quarterly economic forecast, particularly in terms of economic analysis, information sharing. The significance of the move, this move lies in the fact that the differences between the Bank of Korea and the market in economic forecast could be identified, not just in terms of information sharing.
All right, we'll leave our discussion there. Thank you, as always, Professor Kim, for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Thank you very much.
And thank you, Trin, for your in-depth analysis.
Thank you very much.
And that brings us to the end of the show. Thank you for watching, and be sure to tune in same time tomorrow to join our conversation. Goodbye for now.
Completely new. But something anyone can